These are African rhythms.
From WSNC 90.5 FM, a broadcasting service and NPR affiliate of Winston-Salem State University, welcome to Africa World Now Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, meditations on the African diaspora with Dr. Joseph Harris, one of the preeminent scholars on the formation and study of the African diaspora. Africa World Now Project is next. According to Patterson and Kelley, attempts to identify and make sense of the African diaspora are almost as old as the diaspora itself. Dating back to at least Juan Latino, a 16th century Spanish black professor at Granada, Ottobah, Cuagano, and Olaudah, Equiano, and Jose Manuel Valdes, an Afro Peruvian physician who proved that cancer was not contagious in the 18th and 19th centuries, black writers and activists have often defined themselves as a part of the larger international black community. Their political and cultural vision crisscrossed the oceans from the U.S. to Africa, from the Caribbean to Europe, throughout the Middle East, across the Indian Ocean to South Pacific, sometimes incorporating the struggles of indigenous peoples. The presumption that black people worldwide share a common culture was a response to a political imperative, an imperative that led to the formation of political and cultural movements premised on international solidarity. Thus, while acknowledging that African cultural elements survived the forced dispersal throughout the Americas and the Caribbean, we must always keep in mind that diasporic identities are socially and historically constituted, reconstituted, and reproduced, and that any sense of a collective identity among black peoples wherever they are found throughout the world is contingent and constantly shifting. Neither the fact of blackness nor shared experiences under racism nor the historical processes of their dispersal makes for community or even a common identity. Yet it was precisely out of the historical struggle to resist this domination that a concept of authentic identity emerged alongside a discourse of difference and discontinuity. Stuart Hall identifies these two opposing but dialectically linked conceptions of identity in his essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora. He writes, "The first position defines cultural identity in terms of one shared culture, a sort of collective one true self, hiding inside the many other more superficial or artificially imposed selves, which people with a shared history and ancestry hold in common. Within the terms of this definition, our cultural identities reflect their common historical experiences and shared cultural codes, which provides us as one people with stable, unchanging, and continuous frames of reference and meaning, beneath the shifting divisions and vicissitudes of our actual history." Hall goes on to argue that this essentializing project was central to anti-colonial and pan-Africanist movements and counter-hegemonic in a fundamental way, imposing an imaginary coherence on the experience of dispersal and fragmentation, which is the history of all enforced diasporas. Hall's conception of articulation offers one way to think through these tensions and bring differences and discontinuities to the fore. Articulation is thus the form of the connection that can make a unity of two different elements under certain conditions. It is a linkage which is not necessary, determined, absolute, and essential for all time. You have to ask, under what circumstances can a connection be forged or made? So the so-called unit of a discourse is really the articulation of different distinct elements which can be re-articulated in different ways because they have no necessarily belongingness. The unit which matters in a linkage between that articulated discourse and the social forces with which it can, under certain historical conditions, but need not necessarily be connected. For Stuart Hall, the linkages, therefore, that tie the diaspora together must be articulated and are not inevitable. These linkages are always historically constituted. As a result, diaspora is both a process and a condition. As a process, it is constantly being remade through movement, migration, and travel, as well as imagined through thought, cultural production, and political struggle. Yet as a condition, it is directly tied to the processes by which it is being made and remade. In other words, the African diaspora itself exists within the context of global race and gender hierarchies, which are, according to Patterson and Kelley, formulated and reconstituted across national boundaries and along several lines. These lines are found, 1, along the legal lines that curtail citizenship in polities that claim to be democratic, 2. Along the cultural lines that ascribe negative cultural value to indigenous forms while simultaneously appropriating these expressive cultures for political and commercial purposes. 3. Along the economic lines through the planned persistence of plantation colonial economies and a world market that makes those economies untenable. Along imperial lines through the international development of Jim Crow modes of industrial production. And 5. Along social lines through systems that define and limit access based on race, class, caste, and gender in both open and segregated societies. Our limited conceptualization of race distorts the processes of African world unity or identity. In order to move beyond this limited conceptualization, according to Stuart Hall, race must be understood as a floating signifier.
What do I mean by a floating signifier? Well, to put it crudely, race is one of those major concepts which organize the great classificatory systems of difference which operate in human societies. And to say that race is a discursive category recognizes that all attempts to ground this concept scientifically, to locate differences between the races on what one might call scientific, biological, or genetic grounds, have been largely shown to be untenable. We must therefore, it said, substitute a socio-historical or cultural definition of race for the biological one. As the philosopher Anthony Appiah once put it succinctly, that it's time, as it were, that the biological concept of race was sunk without trace. Race is more like a language than it is like the way in which we are biologically constituted. Signifiers refer to the systems and concepts of the classification of a culture, to its making meaning practices, and those things gain their meaning not because of what they contain in their essence, but in the shifting relations of difference which they establish with other concepts and ideas in a signifying field. Their meaning, because it is relational and not essential, can never be finally fixed, but is subject to the constant process of redefinition and appropriation. But you may say, can you seriously be claiming that it is simply a signifier, an empty sign, that it is not fixed in its inner nature, that it cannot be secured in its meaning, that it floats in a sea of relational differences? Is that the argument that you're advancing? And isn't it not only wrong, but a trivial, and I hear the word being rustled in the audience, an idealist approach to the brute facts of human history, which after all have disfigured the lives and crippled and constrained the potentialities of literally millions of the world's dispossessed. After all, why don't we use the evidence of our eyes? If race was such a complicated thing, why would it be so manifestly obvious to everywhere we look? I better say it again because I can feel the sense of relief that after skirting around through these various discursive structures, we've come to what, after all, we all know about race. It's reality. You can see its effects. You can see it in the faces of the people around you. You can see people pulling their skirts aside as people from another racial group come into the room. You can see the operation of racial discrimination in institutions and so on. What is the need of all this scholarly hullabaloo about race when you can just turn to its reality? What trail through history is more literally marked by blood and violence, by the genocide of the Middle Passage, the horrors of plantation servitude, and the hanging tree? A signifier, a discourse, yes, that is my argument.
What we will hear next is a recent talk for Dr. Joseph Harris, where he explores the evolution, current state, and the challenges of diaspora studies it faces moving forward. Dr. Joseph Harris is a retired Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History from Howard University. Over the course of his long professional career, Dr. Harris has authored a number of books and edited volumes. He has published more than 75 scholarly articles and chapters exploring the continuities and discontinuities of the African world. His seminal Global Dimensions of the African Diaspora, published in 1982, a collection of essays that grew out of conferences he organized at Howard University in 1979 and at the University of Nairobi in 1981, is widely credited with establishing the field of African diaspora studies. His monographs on the African presence in Asia, colonial Kenya, and African American reactions to the war in Ethiopia provide interpretive windows into the vast temporal and geographical dimensions of the diaspora that he envisioned. Harris's international collaborations have built important networks of scholars and organizations with an interest in African diaspora. He was founder and first president of the West African Research Association in Senegal, and he served as the vice president of the International African Studies Association. From 1994 to 2004, he collaborated with the United Nations Educational, Scientific, Cultural Organization's Slave Route Project. In January 2008, Dr. Harris organized and moderated an important symposium at the National Archives on the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade, and he collaborated with L. Douglas Wilder, former governor of Virginia and past mayor of Richmond, Virginia, to establish a National Slavery Museum in Petersburg, Virginia. His honors include the American Historical Association's Troyer Still Anderson Prize, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Smithsonian Institution Program in African American Culture, a Distinguished Africanist Award from the African Studies Association, Distinguished Alumni Award from Howard University, and the Carter G. Woodson Medallion for Scholarship Award from the Association for the Study of American Life and History. For over 40 years, Dr. Joseph E. Harris pioneered and then elaborated a conceptual framework for linking the history, culture, politics of African-descended people across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Enjoy the program.
For that very generous introduction. You almost gave what I was going to say. So if you sense a little redundancy, that's okay. Let me apologize for being a little late. I don't like to start out by being late. But the traffic was heavier. I live sort of in the country. I live about 50 miles from here. But I heard about this affair and was so excited about being here that I decided I had to come, in spite of the distance and a little bit of rain. So here we are. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what I call the African Diaspora Trail and Howard University, a continuing challenge, a continuing challenge. When I came to Howard University, and I wasn't sure I was going to talk about dates, but Sonia has already told you when I was here, so you know I'm a relic of the past. There are 2 or 3 of us call ourselves the dinosaurs of the history profession, but we're still here. When I came to Howard University, what we call now the African diaspora, indeed, African history and African American history, were not academically accepted by the academy. Hardly anywhere, with the exception of Howard University. And it was difficult to major in those fields when you think about it, because the opportunities for graduates required a degree, and students always want a degree that will help them get a job. And if there are no places to teach, and that's where most of us were going to end up, then why major in a field that is not academically accepted? But Howard had an advantage. And anyone who has heard me speak, I like to speak about the uniqueness and irreplaceability of Howard University. Because although the field, neither African studies nor African American studies, was an acceptable field at the time, Howard pursued. And what I want to start off by saying in a very special way is that this room in which you now sit, well, I guess was referred to as the room. It was the Mullen Spingarn room, and that's just the space here. And Dorothy Porter, I want to emphasize, was a very important person in that regard. Back in those days, of course, there were few women who challenged in these fields, but she was one of those and deserves to be much better known, not only as a curator for the Mullen Spingarn room here in archives. She was also an author. She traveled and she published. But one of the things that I like to think of Dorothy, and I knew she was a bit older than I, but I got to know her because I spent a lot of time in this room years ago, much less comfortable than it is now, crowded. And I always looked around, all those pictures, and it's good to see them again. Several of those were my teachers. But Dorothy Porter, in addition to being a curator, had one special characteristic about her that proved to be, I think, very significant. She would identify the authors who were black. Now, to some of you, you might wonder why is that so important? Because it was not just a question of esteem and pride, but it was that for some of us. But it was because there was, at that time, the feeling generally that blacks had no history, no culture, and were not worthy of study. Not worthy of study. If I get distracted, I have been here a long time, and now and then I see a face that I think I remember. I don't know, it's been so long ago. But I was one of, I think it's safe to say, one of the first generation, not the first person, but of the first generation to study Africa in an academic sense, who went on to get a degree. There were people in the field, sometimes called lay researchers. They didn't have a degree in the field, but they simply wrote what they knew, frequently from records that they had in the family, that some families had in the Bible and all those places. They collected pictures, and some of these people published books. They tended to be what was called then the lay professors. They couldn't get jobs at the university. No jobs in those fields anyway, but the universities, including the black ones, were requiring degrees. So the early history, and this is not necessarily unique to black folks, if you trace it all the way back, and this is what some of us said in graduate school. If you look at the beginning of history, all of the historical accounts started out with people simply using what we came to know as the oral tradition. The oral tradition. But by the time my generation went to graduate school, people called into question the oral tradition. Oh, Joe, that's nothing but gossip. It's not really history. But the early histories that people read were built on oral traditions. So that was a signal. That somehow stayed in my mind. I was very curious about that. But as a student, like you, I was inclined to accept much of what I was taught. Fortunately, I challenged some of the other things, and here's where Dorothy Porter became important. As I looked for things to write about, I was in the history department here, as Sonia mentioned. What are you going to write about? You know, this is in working on my master's. I did get the bachelor's here, and I did use the room when Dorothy Porter was here, not in as serious a matter as later on, but I did come for papers and so on for my classes. But having gotten a degree, finally, from Northwestern, I had issues there as I had here, different kinds of issues. Many of the professors here had not had the opportunity to get degrees in the field. Many of them taught American history, they could get that. And they could squeeze in African American history here and there, but they had to be careful because people had to pass examinations, and you had chairpersons of departments who would check on you to see that you're following the syllabus, and you didn't want to teach too much Negro history, or you get any credit for that. So, by the time I was in school in the 1950s and coming on into the 60s, when the civil rights movement became important, African nationalism became important, all of a sudden, the universities, government, and so forth, found that Africa may have something there. And so it was then that those of us who had that little feeling in the back of our heads began to say, well, maybe we ought to see if we can document. They say there's no history, no documents. The Africans had no culture. They had no language that was written until the European came. In fact, we then essentially were homegrown. That was the expression we used to use. We must be homegrown. We did not appear until the United States emerged. And within that context, therefore, our history, indeed our culture, began here in the United States. There was a black man, I don't remember, I guess his name was Michaud, yeah, in Harlem. He had a bookstore. Some of you may know that. You know, I know you guys know that. He would come to our conferences. The conference, some of you might know, the ASALA, African American, what is it? The Association of African American History and Life, ASALA. Okay. He would come, and he was an older man, and he would look at some of us who were in school. Why are you going to school to find out what these people you're going to be taught by the very same people who wrote the textbooks that you're using? And if you look in there, you'll see that the United States emerged out of European culture, and Europeans can reach back and they can talk about French history, their French sources, their French legacy. The same thing for the British. But then you see Negro. Now, where is the Negro going to find roots in Negro land? There is no such place. So what are you going to do? How are you going to then study Africa and so on? No one's written about it. Well, that wasn't true. Coming back to Dorothy Porter, we could look at those little cards that she had made. And on each of those, she had put Negro with a Negro writer. And some of those were Africans. Some of them were African Americans. They were early travelers, they were merchants, they were missionaries. And the Africans would write about some of their local societies. So that gave us a little peephole on that. So I always remember Moreland in that sense, and I didn't realize that because of that connection, I would be here many years later, including tonight. So it's about coming full circle to pay a tribute to Moreland Spingarn. In spite of all of that, there were people here at Howard who, in their spare time, I guess you would say, because they weren't paid to develop Negro history, history of culture of black folks. But they were just interested in it, some of them. So in addition to teaching American history, they would squeeze in Negro history, and in some of the schools, including Howard, some of them would teach a course now and then on Negro history. They weren't always that attractive, I can say to you, for the reason that I said earlier, unless you were just interested in it. And so we must identify, it seems to me, as part of our legacy, those people who, in spite of those difficult times, without textbooks and so forth, put together courses on blacks, on Africans. My professor here at Howard, principally, Rayford Logan, I guess his picture's there someplace, but all the great professors. Is he there? Rayford Logan. And one or two of them, yeah, Rayford Logan was one, the major one. There was Charles Wesley, both of whom became chairpersons of the history department. They had their degrees. They didn't write in those fields initially, but they developed and became experts of a sort. And I don't mean that to characterize them that way, but they did not have the kind of access. And among those who was part of that tradition was William Leo Hansberry. They taught black history, which we later came. It wasn't even labeled that. What Hansberry taught was an Ethiopian program. Ethiopia historically had a significance, so that one could get away with teaching that. But the important thing is, I think, is that there were those pioneers in the history department, but there was also another person who was very significant that, like Dorothy Porter, few people talk about. Mark Hannah Watkins. Anybody, any of you know about, heard him? See, that's a shame. Kind of easy to forget, and I guess in a way, he was a very withdrawn person. I was a student here. And he wanted to study African languages, of all things. I never understood, I never knew him well enough to talk to him. Why would someone at that point want to struggle with African languages when you didn't have those other surroundings? You didn't have books and so forth to learn about the culture of Africans. But one thing that Howard University had great access to, that was African students. African students. They, like African Americans, were confined largely to historically black colleges and universities. And so Mark Hannah Watkins, who was a linguist, would gather together African students and record their languages and try to learn and analyze those languages. And while African Americans had no entrenched root in the professional societies, did not mean that they didn't know people in those societies, because they had studied in some of the major universities, which would not accept blacks as students, but would socialize with blacks. The same was true in history. You couldn't find, it was a long time before blacks became members of the American Historical Association, for example. And I can remember one of the reasons I keep coming back to her. I can always see little Dorothy Porter at the African Studies Association. No black folks were there but Dorothy Porter and one or two others I knew. So that means they had contacts.
We are currently listening to a recent and rare talk by Dr. Joseph E. Harris, where he is exploring the development, proliferation, and current challenges of African diaspora studies. He highlights important scholars who worked within some of the most constrained conditions to develop a study of the African world, such as, but not limited to, Rayford Logan, Dorothy Porter, Leo Hansberry, etc. Dr. Joseph Harris is a retired Distinguished Professor Emeritus of History from Howard University. Over the course of his long professional career, Dr. Harris has authored a number of books and edited volumes. He has published more than 75 articles and chapters exploring the continuities and discontinuities of the African world. His seminal Global Dimensions of the African Diaspora, published in 1982, a collection of essays that grew out of conferences he organized at Howard University in 1979 and at the University of Nairobi in 1981, is widely credited with establishing the field of African diaspora studies. For over 40 years, Dr. Joseph E. Harris pioneered and then elaborated a conceptual framework for linking the histories, culture, politics of African-descended peoples across the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descended communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all people. Continue to enjoy the program.
Perspective that you could read and reinterpret and see what these people saw. At least they knew the places where they went, and so on. So Mark Hanna Watkins, Rayford Logan, William Neal Hansberry, those were people I knew. And there were other people in different disciplines who followed that same kind of tradition. So Mullen Spingarn has a very rich place. It has a legacy in the field of African and African American studies. I guess it's correct to say that Mullen Spingarn and the Schomburg Collection in New York were the two major repositories for materials on the black experience. Now, you might hear me use different terms, the black experience, tradition, and so on, because diaspora was not a term that was utilized. And as I said, Negro studies and so on and so forth. Believe it or not, there was a proposal that surfaced at Howard. There were at least two professors who, in my judgment, were in the diasporic tradition. And by that, when I speak of diaspora, I'm speaking about linkages. I'm speaking about teaching about a field of study that is broader than the narrow confines, the national confines, so that people who taught United States history could include a study or some work on the Negro at that time. But they kept it as American history. They were specialists on American history. And that was fair enough. They had received their degrees in that. But those people who were inclined, and some were more political than others, and saw a political demand that came, some of them came out of the tradition of that black bookstore owner I told you, who happened to have been from Barbados, very black-oriented. He said, you just look at it, think about it. Where'd you come from? Do you ever think about that? And I often thought about it, but you know, in the earlier days, families did not talk much about that for a lot of reasons. A lot of families were ashamed to speak about the Negro tradition because of the stereotypes that blacks had no culture, no language. Why do you want to study something like that, for example? I heard that in my family, so I'm not making fun of anybody, although they didn't like it later on when I decided I wanted to study that which had not been studied very well. And one of my favorite aunts, who was very black, very African, why do you want to study that? And I often wonder, I said, if I'd been a little older, I said, because I want to understand you. And that's the point, you know, that's the tradition that I'm saying, the opportunity. To the extent that blacks were not being studied, meant that those of us, if we wanted to, could go out on that frontier, because nobody else had done it. It's not true that nobody else had done it. John O. Franklin, I think all of you know him. Do you? You don't? John O. Franklin was one of those at Howard University. One of my professors back in those days. You look at me, you wonder what those days were. But John O. Franklin was one of my professors, and he was one of the individuals whose studies sort of motivated me into getting involved in Africa. Rayford Logan had been one of his advisors, and it was Rayford Logan who, as I told you before, introduced me to Africa. And I can recall he called me in on one occasion and pulled a map down on the wall and pointed to it and said, "Mr. Harris, that is the continent of the future." He was giving lectures around the country on Africa, and Howard professors began to get more and more attention because they were the ones who had been studying Africa from the early stage. When I became chairman of the history department, for example, in 1975, you look surprised about it. So that was a long time ago. But we would get a lot of calls from white universities because those African students that I mentioned earlier, many of them wrote about their own societies, wrote about their culture. Some of them wrote about their languages. And you know the story probably of Hansberry. He wanted to go to Harvard to get a degree. But they said, you know, we don't have anybody to teach you. So that meant he couldn't get that. He's just one example that people bring up a great deal. So that we had those limitations, but stuck with it. Some of those books that nobody was reading today in those cases were at one point being read and understood and reinterpreted. So we get then to the area that becomes, I think, more germane to the diaspora. And that is the civil rights movement in this country, the African nationalist movement in Africa, required experts in government, in business, in the universities. And so it was then in 1954, the Ford Foundation awarded grants to 3 universities to develop African studies. What William Leo Hansberry had developed back in the 1920s at Howard University was not regarded as a program in African studies. He had no degree. He'd never been to Africa, although he had applied and had a lot of difficulty. So the Ford Foundation grants were to introduce, quote, academic programs in Africa, or on Africa. Rayford Logan, whom I've mentioned before, was part of that. There was a small group. Rayford Logan from history, E. Franklin Frazier in sociology, some of you may know, Mark Hanna Watkins, I mentioned earlier, in language, and Anthony Rayner in geography. That was the core group. And that was in 1954. And the other two universities were Northwestern and Boston. Northwestern got the larger share, Boston the second share, and then Howard University. But that's okay, because we learn to develop what we have with the resources that we have. So those were the three programs, and my master's degree came out of that program at Howard University. But Howard didn't give PhDs, so that was a master's program. But as I said, it was Logan at that point, I wrote under Logan. It was Logan who said, Africa is the continent of the future. Go there and you will succeed. Well, I don't know if I succeeded or not, but I went on with his recommendation and recommendation John O. Franklin and some others to Northwestern. So I went to two of those three universities. Now, while that was happening, something else was happening. I don't know if you know UNESCO. Some of you know UNESCO. UNESCO is what? The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, right? Okay. The cultural side of UNESCO became very significant, because with the development of nationalism in Africa, all of a sudden, people in the United States are looking on television, these black people, who was that? All these robes flowing across the screen. People speaking these funny language. What does he speak? I didn't know did they speak a different language? You know? It was an exciting time. And so it was then that people who had studied in those fields, blacks largely, became very significant. Rayford Logan was making all these speeches around. E. Franklin Fraser, sociologist, had a somewhat different perspective, but it was also a part of the African tradition. Now the question was with UNESCO, as new states emerged, what about their culture that people said they didn't have? What have they been studying all these years? My first experience in Africa, and I was determined to legitimize paying a lot of sacrifice. Now, some of you probably think you're paying a lot of sacrifice and so on. But I was determined that in developing as a historian, that I would go to Africa. I'd have to find out and look and see for myself. And I'll tell you this, although I had a great experience at Northwestern, great professors. Some of you may have heard of Melville Herskovitz, great anthropologist, who had taught here at Howard University for a while, and who briefly, he changed his mind, but he was briefly one of those anthropologists measuring black folks' heads. You know, they used to measure the head to try to determine how much intelligence, we had, and so on. But he worked here at Howard for a while, and I guess they kind of straightened him out. So he became one of the leading Africanists, and if you have not read it, although there are questions you'll have about it, Myth of the Negro Past. Somebody back there, I can read your lips saying that. A great work, but like all great works, can be criticized, because it was also, I studied with Herskovitz, and one of the ironies of it was he didn't mind saying that he wondered if a Negro could write a history of Africa. And again, I heard him say that. I didn't say anything either. But I did take some of the tools You know, we worked together. They had developed the tools of the African tradition, oral traditions. They had the contacts with the foundations and universities. So we have to use their resources to do what we want to do many times. And so Herskovits, I'll have to admit, was one who helped me get a scholarship to go to Northwestern, and I enjoyed it immensely. But especially because Northwestern, having gotten the largest share of that foundation money, was able to bring Africans in. They had a lot of African students. And he developed what became the pioneer academic institution for African studies. I was out there a couple of months ago. The huge library, the library is, you know, as large as just for Africa. Not talking about the whole library, but the African library was larger than this building, for example. All kinds of materials and so on. Now, I don't know whether I'm talking too long, but I don't plan to talk. Just give me one more hour. And I want to make up because I was a little late, and I don't want you to miss anything. Now, she's going to miss something, but that's she's going to miss something. But the whole point here is there was a demand, and again, it spread out into all kinds of fields. Howard began to use its monies to support the study of Africa in the several departments here at Howard, and to fund Moreland Spingarn and some of its resources. So the library expanded, and it became, I don't know what date it was, it became the Moreland Spingarn Research Center as opposed to the room. I don't know if the room expanded. I don't think the room expanded much. 1973. See, that's a long time. But African studies then began to emerge. And let me come to the main point I want to make. There were all these people, you know, I mentioned earlier these people in lay historians. And I mentioned people in the different fields of history, geography, and so on that were studying Africa. The question that always bedeviled me at Northwestern, especially, was that diasporic tradition that had not been explored. As people went to different parts of the world, some of those people were still speaking African languages. I was at the University of Dahomey at that time, and the professor in languages said, you know, the purest Yoruba you want to find is in Brazil. In Brazil, I couldn't figure that out. But what he meant was, he had married a Brazilian woman, I guess that helped him. But the African language in his mind was frozen. Nobody spoke that but that little community, a large portion of whom came from Brazil. And they spoke, quote, the old language of Yoruba, whereas the people who remained in Africa became introduced to the Western languages, French in this case. Many of them spoke French more so than in parts of Yoruba land. You can do with that whatever you wish, but the question is, did the language survive? One of the most difficult moments I had professionally was at one of those UNESCO meetings. The advantage of UNESCO was that they held meetings in different parts of the world. So it was a way to travel. So if you could get in on that, you got it made. And it was especially good for Africans because their governments were not going to pay to send them to look at the slave trade and things like that. But UNESCO focused on people of African descent all over the world. So it was an opportunity for some of us who had to get money other ways from the foundations, but that was okay. Ford Foundation monies and Rockefeller and so forth, those monies were available to some of us. So it was an opportunity now to have that direct contact with Africans who are also interested in the slave trade. And what UNESCO did was to develop that program and devoted it to the study of the slave trade, enslavement, and its impact. And some of us were more interested in that impact because that goes beyond slavery and the slave trade. That goes to the impact, whether it's economic, whether it's social, political, and so on. So that those of us who were not, whether you studied the slave trade or not, was less important. It meant then that for those of us who had wondered, as I did some years back, about the extension abroad, how did Africans arrive and forget their history? How did they do that? How did they forget the languages that they had spoken? That's what I mean about the opportunity. To the extent that that was not studied, then we had a field open for those who wanted to take advantage of it. The same thing was true of history. So those of us who entered in that sort of first generation of African history, in my view, had it made out of a disadvantaged situation. And especially where UNESCO was involved. And I cannot give UNESCO, a lot of criticism of UNESCO, cannot give it too much credit because they made the opportunity, they opened up the opportunities for research in areas that had not been done to develop archives. So wherever we met, it's a global thing. Whether we met in Barbados, which we did, in Cuba, which we did, and all over different parts of the world, we were interested in identifying the archives. And that would include music. It would include all aspects of the oral tradition, the aesthetics, the dance, for example, as well as the kind of history I was interested in. And so when I came to Howard, I came back to Howard in 1975. So it was like coming home again. I came with an agenda, and that was the agenda, to find those spaces that had not been filled in, and to see if there were colleagues and others here, and students here. I taught in New England, and it was a great life. And people always, like, oh, you found something. They never got interested in doing more than talking about it. But I wanted to come where I could hear the drums occasionally, and that was Howard University. And here it was where professors and students, now given the civil rights movement and the African nationalist movement and the influx of people from Africa, those were some exciting days. And the monies were available. The opportunities for exchange was available. And so I landed here at Howard University and began to develop what was termed as the African Diaspora Studies tradition. Are you coming to say something to me? What did I tell you? I was going to talk for about 2 hours. Did I say? I thought I said that. It hasn't been an hour yet. But I understand. I'm going to end that. I just want to say to you that the great challenge remains here at Howard University. There's greater competition now because you have those major centers for African studies, for African American studies, and the funds to send people all over the world to develop languages and so on. We struggle here at Howard, but that's a part of the tradition. The challenge is there, And I hope in some way I have inspired you to consider helping to contribute to that legend of Howard University, which I think is irreplaceable. I thank you very much for this.
The importance of history versus memory and professionally distinguishing the two.
Between history and what?
Memory. In oral tradition and memory.
The oral tradition?
Where's the line between memory and history, and what, how do those intersect?
Well, you know, it all to me comes down to memory. What bothered me about that was to say that Africans had no sense of their history was essentially saying they didn't have any memory. That when they arrived here, somehow, as I said, they became homegrown. They going to be born again as Americans. And if you look at the earlier historians, going all the way back to classical time, they began on oral traditions. The great historians visited communities and gathered data, and that is essentially, it's late for African peoples. But the other thing I want to say is I don't want anyone to think that Africans had no language. We knew that. We know they had languages. And they had the griots that were repositories of materials. There were some languages that were indeed written. While Europeans and others looked at the Arabic language in Africa, many of those were Arabic script for other African languages. The area where I visited, I was in Fouta Djallon in Guinea. Well, their language was written using the Arabic script. They were Muslim, of course. So that it breaks down, that tradition then becomes a part of history. Because what tools do you have? And if the tool that you have is language, then there is some continuity between the use of that and the absolute language itself. Now, I don't know how much of that you talked about at Yale, but I think it's an ongoing issue. Even today, we have interviews. What are interviews? Many people use interviews for history. They write history off of that. The difference is, however, with the oral tradition, you are going to compare traditions from one society to another society. You're going to talk to a variety of people, and many times the oral tradition will lead you to some documentation, so that it's not whether one is better than the other in my judgment. They come together. The same as the dance. Dance is a part of this. People are dancing their traditions, and they are recognizing their spiritual others, so to speak. So that, to me, I don't think it's a very significant argument. I'm not discouraged by that at all, and I don't know what your field is, but I would hope that you'll continue with it.
Unity.
Right on.
Diasporical. Radical. Diasporical. Radical.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. We can be reached through all your regular social media platforms. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com or follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Mwizu Mutali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funda Ngunda, senior research, content contributor, and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior researcher and content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technology, and creative director is Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project is heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcasting service of Winston-Salem State University. Shows are archived weekly on SoundCloud. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.
Before it gets dark.